I want to speak to you today on the subject of who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? But before I get to that, I just want to tell you, I guess you could call it a story. You know, there was the citizens of a small village at one time gathered in their town hall for a meeting. And as the citizens were leisurely sitting and talking as they awaited the arrival of the mayor and the start of the meeting, the story goes that suddenly Satan appeared in front of the town hall. And everyone started screaming frantically, running for the exits. And as they made their way to the exits, they were trampling over one another in an effort to get away from Satan. Soon everyone had exited the town hall except an elderly gentleman who sat calmly in his chair without moving. And it said that he was seemingly oblivious to the fact that man's ultimate enemy was in his presence. Satan walked up to the old man and says, "Don't you know who I am?" And the man replied, "Yep, sure do." "Aren't you afraid of me?" Satan asked. "Nope, sure ain't," said the man. "Don't you realize I could kill you with a word?" asked Satan. "Don't doubt it for a minute," said the old man. "Don't you know that I could pronounce horrible physical agony upon you for all eternity?" Satan persisted. "Yep," was the calm reply of the elderly gentleman. "Are you still not afraid?" Satan asked. "Nope," said the man. Satan, now unsettled, asked, "Well, why aren't you afraid of me?" And the old man calmly replied, "I've been married to your sister for the last 48 years. Now, I thought it wise to tell you what I was speaking on, because lest you thought I was going to be talking about marriage. Who is my neighbor? Modern technology is good and a glorious thing, and technology has made it possible for us to do so much more than we could have done even as recent as 10 to 20 years ago. One of the greatest and the most convenient invention, in my view, is the smartphone. One can make more than calls, Brother Hasty, with a smartphone. It replaces a camera. It replaces a audio or video recorder. It's a notebook and a pen. It's a watch. It replaces a conventional calendar or diary. And for those who game, it is a gaming device. It's a book. Almost any book or textbook that you want to read, you can do it on a smartphone or tablet. It has tons of devices and tons of apps, and it replaces tons of devices and other items that we regularly use. You know what type of phone that is, huh? Oh yeah, it's a telephone directory also. Unfortunately, we do not always use the good things that we have been given to do good. On the 21st of July, 2017, the online edition of the New York Times carried a story under the caption, "Teenagers recorded a drowning man and laughed." The article outlined how 5 teenagers between the ages of 14 and 18 laughed as they stood on the shore and they watched a man struggling in the water in a pond. One of the teens used his cell phone to record the event. The man drowned and his body was found several days later. It was revealed that the 5 teenagers did absolutely nothing to help the drowning man, not even call 911. Instead, one of the teens used the video on his cell phone to record the event. And as the video was reviewed, it showed the man struggling in the middle of this body of water as the teenage, we heard in the background, describing his struggle and laughing at him from the shore. One of them cursed and they called the drowning man a junkie. And they could be heard taunting the man as he struggled to hold on to life. And they shouted, "Someone tell him that do not expect any assistance. Ain't nobody going to help you," they said. "You shouldn't have gotten in there." And about a minute into the video, the man appears to have let out a final whimper before submerging fully under the water. And as you listen to the tape, you hear one of the children saying, "He just died." And you hear the voice of the others in the background laughing. On April 28, 2010, ABC News carried a story entitled, "Dying Good Samaritan Ignored. City Living?" And they asked why a homeless hero by the name of Hugo Alfredo Tail Yax died on the streets of New York City. Hugo was 31 years old, and he collapsed on the Queens, New York street sidewalk after he was stabbed several times by a mugger after he would have come to the aid of a woman who was being robbed by that very same mugger. Hugo's motionless body is reported to have laid on that sidewalk. And because of his injured state, and notwithstanding his injured state, it did not inspire a single passerby to help or to alert the police until he has been lying there bleeding for over 1 hour. This homeless Good Samaritan risked and ultimately sacrificed his life to help a stranger, yet his kindness was not returned. Not by one of the single bypasses that passed. And they had video of the event. And it is reported that some 20 individuals passed by this man laying on the sidewalk on Queens, New York. The video showed one man stopped and rolled him over, but walked away. Another used his cell phone and snapped a picture of the dying man. And by the time 911 was called and help arrived, this man was already dead. The woman he saved fled the scene before he even collapsed. And the article indicated that she was never identified, suggesting that she never came forward to say thank you even after the passing of this man. And this has caused experts to look at this phenomenon that is occurring in this world. And some have rationalized and they reason that people are not helping because they do not want to help. Or they're not helping because they do not necessarily does not care. But they rationalized and they said instead this symptom may be, or this behavior may be a symptom of their environment. That is the city living, the city life that they are experiencing. Others say that sometimes it may be what they coined the bystander effect. It's a phenomenon in which occurs in individuals who fail to respond because they assume that someone else is going to respond or act. And captured under this phenomenon, they say that sometimes people are motivated not to respond because they are too busy, they are detached from the real world and what's going on around them. They just see, but they do not see. And still others say that cultural changes and the desensitization, desensitization of masses because of violence, and the results because of the exposure, the massive exposure that we have to violence in our movies, in our videos, in our games, and even in our music. That it has changed our perspective of life. And it has numbed us and has dulled the natural sensitivity that God has given to us. That we are no longer feeling people, we no longer care, we can't see anymore. And Jesus, during his ministry here, he told a similar story to those two stories that I told you from the New York Times and from ABC News. And often we judge the priest and the Levite harshly. But the truth be told, the best among us today would have probably walked past and stepped over the body of Hugo as he lied on the sidewalk in Queens, New York. And you may ask why. Because we may have concluded from looking at the man that he was homeless. We may have concluded that he was a dirty bum, that he may have been smelly, that he may have been drunk. We may have even concluded that he was a drug addict, or he got what he deserved. And we would have rationalized in our minds that this man was not my neighbor. And so this is the question I have for us today. Who is my neighbor? In Luke chapter 10 and verse number 25, we are told that this question was put to Jesus by a certain lawyer. And we are told that, behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "What is written in the law? What is your reading of it?" And he answered and said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbors as yourself." And he said to him, You have answered rightly. Do this and live." But he wanted to justify himself, said to Jesus, he wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" This particular text, we have here a lawyer, an expert in the Jewish and Mosaic laws. He stood up and he sought to test Jesus. And scholars say that the idea behind this word test is not necessarily, it should not necessarily be taken in a negative way or a negative light. He may not have meant any evil when he sought to test Jesus. He may indeed have been sincere initially with his question, as he wanted to know, what shall I do to inherit eternal life. And in response, Jesus points this lawyer back to what was written in the law. If the question is, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Then the answer was simple. Keep the law of God. You should love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. It appears that this lawyer was wise enough, he was sharp enough to know the essence of the law, and he was able to give Jesus the essence of the law, that voice which sums up the law. Now, all the man had to do was to live what he knew. And Jesus told him as much. He says, do this and you will live. It is clear enough that he understood the essence of the law. But no doubt, like us, he found it difficult to fully comprehend what the law was saying, or difficult to execute or to live up to the standards of the law. No doubt there was much confusion on what it meant to love your neighbor as yourself. And I guess some can conclude that we ought to love ourselves before we can love anybody else, but that's not what the text is saying to him or saying to us. It's essentially telling us in the same way that we care for ourselves, with the same concern and interest that we have in ourselves, that is the same measure of care, interest, and concern that we ought to have for others. But this man, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" You see, this lawyer was measuring himself to both commands. And based on his understanding of what he comprehended his neighbor to be, he wanted to see what Jesus' view on who his neighbor was. And it appears that he concluded that he would have obeyed the first part of the command. But it was in the second part of this command that he had some issues or had some questions on. And by his question to Jesus, he was essentially saying, how do you find a neighbor? Who is one's neighbor? But I want to suggest that this man perhaps was making a bigger mistake than he realized. You see, he assumed that he fully understood and that he was living fully up to the commitment that the command called for in the first instance, on the measure of love that he ought to have for his God. And perhaps some of us may be under the same delusion. We ought to love the Lord our God with all of our hearts, with all of our soul, with all of our strength, and all of our mind. But we know we live in this world, and in this world we get distracted. And some of us, as Ali said, that we sometimes get distracted even in this environment. In this closed environment, we are still distracted. So now imagine life. Imagine life out in the real world, the distractions that come. But this man concluded that he had mastered it, that he truly loved the Lord his God with all his heart, mind, and soul. And he made another mistake in thinking that he could fulfill the commitment or the commandment to love God with all that he had, with all of his essence, and still not fully understand the second part of that command, to love your neighbor. You see, he separated the two commands. He believed that he could love God as God asked him to, but he could do so and not fully understand who his neighbor was, or that he could treat his neighbor unkindly or harshly, and believe that he was still loving God as he called him to love him. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse number 20 and 21, it tells us, if someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, how can he love God, whom he has not seen? And this commandment we have from him, that that he who loves God must love his brother also. You see, the two go hand in hand. If we claim to love God, we must also love our brothers. We must love our neighbor. And this is the point that the man was missing. And this is the point that sometimes we miss. And perhaps the third mistake that this man made was the manner in which the method that he used to narrowly define who his neighbor was. And his definition of who his neighbor was based on his tradition. It was based on his wearing and the custom of his people. And sometimes we fall into the same trap. Only our friends and our family and those who are easy to love and those who perhaps live next door to us are our neighbors. That's how we define it. And if it depended on that narrow definition, perhaps this man was doing all that he thought he ought to be doing. It's important for us to understand that the Jews in Jesus' day, they ascribed to the view, they believed that one ought to love their neighbor. But they also taught that there was a duty before God to hate their enemies. And so it appears that it depended on who or what or how you define your neighbor, whether or not you regarded yourself as being faithful to the commands of God. But Jesus sought to help this man. And he seeks also to help us to understand this concept of who our neighbor is. As Jesus continues on in verses number 30. And we're told that then Jesus answered and said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves who stripped him of his clothing and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. And we're told now by chance a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he arrived at the place, he came and he looked down and he passed by on the other side also. But a certain Samaritan, and Chris talked about the Samaritan and the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritan earlier this morning. A certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion. And so he went to him and he bandaged his wounds and he poured on oil and wine. And he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day, the text tells us, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii and he gave it to the innkeeper and he said to him, take care of him. And whatever you spend, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you. So Jesus sought to set this man straight on who really is his neighbor. Because Jesus understood the mindset of this man. He was aware of the traditions and the enmity that existed between this man's religion and others. And so Jesus told this story about this infamous road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And scholars tell us that this was a road that many were aware of. Just as there are high crime areas in our country and we are somewhat aware of them, this road was well known. And so it should not have been surprising when Jesus began to tell this story that his listeners recognized that he used this road that this thing could have happened on. Jesus used two individuals that they no doubt had respect for, Jewish religious leaders, the priest and the Levite. And some scholars suggest that the man that was injured was a Jew. The text isn't clear in that regard. It says simply a certain man. Or we know that it was a man. And these two religious men, with all their religious training, when they saw this man, both passed by on the other side. I can imagine that they had some very good excuses. I can imagine if we were there with them, that we perhaps would have helped them to come up with some excuses. We already know that this is a dangerous road. We're taking a chance passing through this area, just like how some areas in Nassau, right, Greg? I mean to suggest your area. Because your area is good now. I can imagine they would have said to themselves, there's got to be a setup. Ain't nothing wrong with that man. He trying to get me to come over there, and as soon as I come over there to render some aid, the fellas come and bum rush me. That's still a word, eh? I can imagine that they were on their way to someplace. They had something to do. I would assume that they were perhaps, who knows? I mean, they may have had some duty for the Lord to do, and they wanted to get to where they were going to perform the duty that they were going to perform. And so they cannot be late. God forbid that they're late. Perhaps it may have been to visit some family member or someone of importance. And it was urgent, so they had to get to where they were going. Perhaps they rationalize, as we sometimes do, someone else will help him. Someone else already saw him and already gone for help. They're coming back. Some, they may have said, well, you know, I ain't dressed really right now to bother with nobody who bleeding. I can't get blood on my nice, good robe. They may have rationalized, well, you know, I never was good with first aid. I don't know how to help this man. Ain't nothing I can do for this man. They may have looked across as they walk past and conclude that, well, he half dead, he almost dead now, you know, there's nothing else I can do for this man. Time as I go and get help, he'll already be dead. may have concluded, well, I can't carry him. Ain't nothing I can do for this man. I can't lift him, can't put him across my back to carry him. But I can pray for him. They may have concluded that this man was no good and he perhaps got what he deserved. He brought what he got upon himself. He shouldn't be walking on that side of the road. He should have walked on this side. And that wouldn't have happened. He perhaps wouldn't have been able to get away. Or they may have simply said, he never asked for help. All these are excuses that they could have reasonably made to justify in their minds why they ought not to stop. But we're told, but a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, he came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. In Jesus' story, we see that the Samaritan had compassion, the priest and the Levite had excuses. And I assume that the audience whom Jesus was speaking, when they heard about the priest and the Levite and their reactions, no doubt they probably thought that, yes, well, no doubt a common Jew would save the day. Someone from their religion, a Jew would come by and he would do what the priest and the Levite failed to do. I'm sure they never thought that the story would take the twist that it took. That Jesus would introduce this Samaritan, this compassionate Samaritan. And no doubt they were shocked by what they heard. That a Samaritan had the capacity to have compassion. What was so special? Chris told us about some of the things that existed. What was so special about the Samaritans? Generally speaking, the Samaritan and the Jews, they despised each other. They were divided racially and religiously. And with the prevailing culture and the discrimination that was practiced against the Samaritans and how they were regarded by the Jews, it would have been easy for this Samaritan to rationalize in his mind that he ought to stay on his side of the road, keep his head straight, and go about his business. This Samaritan had plenty good reasons why he should pass this man by. He no doubt would have heard that some of the rabbis, the Jewish rabbis, taught that a Jew was forbidden to help a Gentile woman in distress when she was giving birth. Because to do so, and if they are successful, it will only result in another Gentile coming into this world, and they despise these individuals. They regarded the Samaritans as the worst of the worst. And they placed them as a level below all of the other groupings that they had contempt for. The lowest rung on the ladder was the Samaritan in the eyes of the Jews. But this Samaritan man, he had compassion. And he went and he bandaged the wounds of this half-dead man, pouring on oil and wine. And he set him on his own animal. I'm not sure if he had more than one animal, but he set him on his own animal. And so it paints a picture in my mind of him denying himself the comfort of transportation to the village, and allowing this man to lie on his beast of burden. He was willing not only to stop and to treat the man, but he was willing to deny himself some of the comforts. He was willing to walk. And I don't know how far the walk was from that point, But he determined in his mind that no matter how far it was from there to the end, I'm going to carry this man and deliver him to the end, and I will walk. And he could have simply dropped him at the door and knock on the door and then run off. But instead, he went to the innkeeper. He really he put the man up, treated the man. And you know, this morning we talk about the wine and the olive and the oil. You know, scholars say that the wine had a cooling effect, or it had a antiseptic effect on the man's wound. And the oil was soothing, easing the pain. And so he took him and he cared for this man. And having no doubt responsibilities, he had to continue on in his journey. He didn't just leave the man there for the innkeeper to throw him out. He paid for the man to stay and for the innkeeper to take care of him. He went over and above what any reasonable person would have done. We are told that the amount of money that he left with the innkeeper could have lasted for at least 2 to 3 weeks. He didn't leave a small amount. You know, do this could do and what this can't do, you throw him out. No. He saw the injuries that this man had. And he used his resources to ensure that this man would have been taken care of. And even if the money that he left was not enough, he said, listen here, my brother, I want you to take care of this man. I promise you that when I return, if there is more that you have to expend, I will pay you back. This man was truly a neighbor. In verse number 36 and 37, Jesus, now making application of this parable, he asks the man, did you learn anything? Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? And no doubt, this man was no doubt choked up, and no doubt he did not want to say what he had to say. And he said simply, the one who showed mercy on him. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. Because of his prejudice, because of the enmity between them, he could not even call them the Samaritan by name. He could not say the Samaritan was the one. Instead, he said, the one who showed mercy on him. He didn't expect the Samaritan, the enemy of his people, to be the hero of this story. But because the priest and the Levite failed to be a neighbor to this man, the Samaritan showed them how to be a neighbor and defined for him who is a neighbor. And no doubt at this point the lawyer would have recognized that he could no longer justify himself and make the claims that he claimed initially when he started this discussion with Jesus. Because truly, yes, he may have loved God with all of his heart, mind, soul, and strength. But he did not love his neighbor as he loved himself, because he did not know who his neighbor was, or he narrowly defined who his neighbor was. And Jesus saw that, yes, this man was in error, but he had potential. And Jesus simply says to him, go and do likewise. And so again I ask, who is my neighbor? And based on what we would have reviewed, the neighbor is anyone with a need that has been exposed to me and who requires my help. as the children of God, as the people of God, we must resist the inclination to conform and to be like the people of this world, who are hardened and desensitized to the point where it is now impossible for individuals to have compassion. All they have a mind to do is to pull out their smartphones and to record you as you die. You cannot even die now in dignity. They refuse to call for help. Instead, they will record you with your last breath and then they will post it on WhatsApp or Facebook. Because we do not now recognize who our neighbors are, or we have lost our humanity. We have no compassion. And as the people of God, we must not be like those 5 teenage boys from Florida in the New York Times story. Nor must we be like those 20+ people who walk the streets of Queens, New York, who moved past this dying man, this bleeding, dying Good Samaritan, and they allowed him to die. Let us always use the good things that we have to do good and not to do evil. That's my words of encouragement for us today. Who is my neighbor? Anyone who I see that has a need. Anyone who comes to my attention that has a need, he is my neighbor, be him family, friend, or foe. That is my neighbor. And there is an expectation that we as the children of God will be good neighbors to all manner of men. If you are subject to the Savior's invitation, I invite you to come as we stand and we pray.